meu nome é Otávio Dias, eu sou jornalista, trabalho aqui na Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, e hoje eu vou moderar este evento, substituindo o nosso diretor, o Sérgio Fausto, que teve uma questão familiar e, infelizmente, não poderá estar aqui conosco hoje, mas então eu toco o barco aqui. Eu gostaria apenas de falar aqui um pouquinho que o título do nosso seminário, né? Eu vou falar no início em português, depois eu passo para o inglês. Então, o título do nosso seminário é A Extrema Direita nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil, diferenças e similaridades. Nós temos aqui conosco hoje a professora Cynthia Miller-Idriss, que é socióloga e professora na American University, em Washington. Ela dirige o Laboratório de Pesquisa e Inovação de Polarização e Extremismo, testemunhou no Congresso e colabora com agências dos Estados Unidos nas áreas de política, segurança, educação, inteligência e também com a ONU, justamente sobre esse tema de tendências do extremismo e estratégias de prevenção e desengajamento. Seu livro mais recente é Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. Para conversar com a professora Cynthia, nós temos o Guilherme Casarões. Eu vou falar a bio dele em inglês para a professora Cynthia poder conhecer um pouco melhor. So, Guilherme Casarões, Doctor and Master in Political Science from the University of São Paulo. He's a professor at Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Has researches and articles published in the areas of Brazilian foreign policy, extreme right, and religious nationalism. He's one of the coordinators of the Extreme Right Observatory. The idea today is Professor Cynthia will talk about 15 minutes, and then Professor Guilherme will comment and also talk. She will focus more on the US situation, and Professor Guilherme will focus more on the Brazilian situation, and then they will exchange information. Nós poderemos pegar algumas perguntas aqui do público, selecionaremos mais ou menos umas 6 perguntas, se possível um pouquinho mais, para trazer para os nossos palestrantes. Nós teremos 1h30, então vamos aproveitar bem esse tempo. Eu acho que não é necessário fazer um resumo do que aconteceu nos últimos anos, tanto nos Estados Unidos como no Brasil, acho desnecessário. A única coisa que eu diria é que a ideia deste seminário, deste webinar, é para atualizar a situação da extrema-direita hoje nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil e falar um pouco das perspectivas rumo às eleições presidenciais do ano que vem nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil aí nos próximos 4 anos. So, I spoke a lot already. Professor Cynthia, you have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. For
just a minute, yes. Professor Cynthia. Yes. I made a small mistake. I would like to show the companies that support us. They are very important for our activities. So I will show here the companies that support us and made it possible that we are here today. Thank you very much.
Terrific.
So now we can go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation about the similarities and differences between the US and Brazil, and even globally, which I think is so much of this is circulating globally and is influenced and inspired by global development. So I will talk mostly about the US, but it's sometimes hard to separate out what's happening in the US from the global circulation of these ideas and social media spaces. I'll just make 3 points in my 15 minutes. I want to talk a little bit about the trends that we're seeing in the US and the threat landscape as we move into the next 18 months, which is expected to be a very volatile period of time. Leading to the 2024 election. And then I want to conclude, I always like to conclude with some optimism, because I think we have, for the first time in the US, some real momentum on interventions and on the prevention landscape that is shifting for the first time in over 20 years, the way we look at the prevention of violent extremism and is more responsive and more proactive. So I want to talk a little bit just in a few minutes about that, because I think sometimes it's quite depressing to just tell people all the bad things that are happening without also highlighting some of the spaces for hope, I think. And there are some real spaces for hope. And ultimately, I'm an optimist about what's happening for that reason. So the first thing I'll say is I use the term the extreme right or the far right which I acknowledge is a terrible term. It's a bad term. It's meaning that it can be very hard to define, and it is used in different ways by different countries. There are different terms to refer to the same phenomenon in the UN, in Germany, in the US, and elsewhere. So I do use the term the far right or the extreme right. I think those are the best terms we have available to refer to it, but it's still problematic to capture what it is. It's not only happening when something like anti-Semitism or misogyny, is cutting across a political spectrum. It's not always only sitting on one side. But nonetheless, the far right or the extreme right, the terminology I use, refers to two real trends. One is a rise in supremacist ways of thinking, which set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority between groups of people. That is most common is white supremacist extremism, but we also have rising Western supremacism, male supremacism, Christian supremacism, different types of supremacism that ultimately pose an existential threat directed toward the other group that often is said to need to be met with violence. And so these are ultimately violent, conspiratorial, and fantastical, sometimes mythological movements that believe there's some sort of apocalyptic end times coming that will restore a prior, better mythological utopia at its end time. So at the most extreme, you end up with these accelerationist movements that are looking to restore collapsed society, have a race war, have a civil war, and then restore some fantastical idea of a new civilization, a white, pure male civilization, et cetera, hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. The other side of it is the anti-democratic set of movements, which of course intersect, but the anti-democratic, authoritarian, and in our case, in the US in particular, unlawful militia and paramilitary movements that are mobilizing attacks on elected officials, attacks on law enforcement in some cases, that are trying to collapse government systems and are attacking not people for their identities necessarily, or their gender or their racial identity, but are against the government, anti-government, and unlawful mobilization of militia, sometimes also toward a civil war. Again, sometimes there's overlap across those groups, especially in the US. Sometimes they oppose each other, and I'm happy to talk about that and what that looks like in the question and answer or in the debate. So that's just the background. And then I'm keeping an eye on time here, but the 3 points I want to make briefly here are that on every measure that we have available in the US, and frankly, in most places globally, we are seeing significant increases on both sides of that equation, both on the supremacist and on the anti-government side of things, the anti-democratic side of things. In the US, we now have the most recent data showing a 1900% increase in mass casualty plots since the 1990s. I mean, we're not just seeing trends, we're seeing exponential growth in some of these trends. We have record-breaking growth in hate crimes, record-breaking data on anti-Semitism, on Islamophobia, on anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ attacks and hate. We have record-breaking mass shootings and gun violence in the US, also not always politically motivated, but also at a record high. We now have gun violence, the leading cause of death for children and teenagers in the US. So again, not always politically motivated, but tied to this mobilization of violence. We have also seen significant mainstreaming in the trends of meaning that these are no longer fringe ideas, but they're often right in the center with elected officials espousing them. We have dozens of legislative actions being passed that are targeting trans communities and gender diverse people and the care that they need medically. We have massive numbers of book bannings happening in schools and in libraries that are targeting curricula, anything to do with race or with the teaching of controversial or difficult histories, right? So we have a kind of erasure happening, which is in the mainstream as well. So, you know, on every measure we have the FBI's listing of plots that have been foiled, the lethality of attacks, the numbers of plots, the amount of white supremacist propaganda circulating is also at a record-breaking level. So really, the trends are exceptionally clear. There's really that data, there's no quibbling on it. You can't argue with it. The data is there. It doesn't matter who's collected it. The trends are there in every single case. And the Department of Homeland Security, under both the Trump administration and under the Biden administration, has acknowledged that domestic violent extremism is the most lethal threat facing the nation, and that within that, white supremacist extremism poses the greatest threat to civilians, and anti-government or unlawful militias pose the greatest threat to elected officials and to government entities. So there's quite a bit of agreement about the threat landscape. It depends, the terminology is not the same across all the agencies here, even the words are different, and there's a lot of arguments about the causes for it and about the solutions for it. So there's not universal agreement, but I think the data is pretty clear. On the threat landscape, what we're expecting to see in the next 18 months, unfortunately, is the same trends to be continuing. We are entering an extremely volatile election season with a lot of polarizing rhetoric and hateful rhetoric and opportunistic scapegoating of groups, I think, by politicians that is likely to be anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans, and also some of it anti-Semitic. And that is where we're seeing sort of more suggestive language about Soros funding things, more, dog whistle, we would call it, language, but a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of volatile and harmful things are expected to come out of that. And we have seen that connection between harmful rhetoric or hateful rhetoric coming from elected officials and spikes in hate crimes and local harm and hate happening for quite some time. And we expect that to continue. We're also seeing more blended, across those categories that I talked about. So we've seen a series of threats that are anti-Semitic threats against elected officials, for example. And so we're seeing that kind of combination of anti-government attacks, but directed toward women, for example, with very misogynistic language and slurs used against them in the kidnapping plots, for example, of a governor recently, but also very anti-Semitic language and threats directed specifically toward Jewish officials or toward women who are elected officials. And that, I think, will also continue. So I'll just conclude with here. That's all the bad stuff, and it is bad, and I acknowledge that, and I think we have to acknowledge that communities need to be preparing to support victims, survivors, and targeted groups who are likely to be affected heavily by the kind of propaganda that's circulating, just as we saw during the pandemic, heavy targeting of Asian Americans, for example, and a lot of hate crimes rising against that group. We know there's going to be some really difficult times ahead, and some people are affected more than others and need the support of communities. But I want to leave you with just a little bit about what's happening. So the Biden administration has released 2 years ago now the first ever national strategy to counter domestic violent extremism or domestic terrorism. And it had 4 pillars. And for the first time, the government used the language of a public health response, acknowledging that this is not a problem that can only be addressed with security and law enforcement solutions. It cannot be addressed only through monitoring and surveillance and interruption of plots formulated by groups, because the problem is more diffuse than groups. Only about 7 to 15% of violent terrorist attacks from the far right come from groups. The vast majority of violence comes from individuals who are radicalized, often in online contexts, with no ties back to groups. That's a really different problem than trying to interrupt a plot from an international terrorist group that has a hierarchy of a chain of command and leadership and a clear manifesto and a clear way to pledge loyalty to a group when you commit a terrorist attack. These are different types of problems that need a more upstream approach. And that's what a public health response should do, is invest in education and prevention and community resilience work to strengthen democracy, not only as a defense strengthening, but also as a resilience and cultivation one. So they followed that up, that initial strategy with a summit on hate-fueled violence that was held last September. And that summit was the first time that in the US, I've ever seen people brought together from the local hate crimes perspective and the national domestic terrorism side. So you had the, both law enforcement and national security officials there, but also you had folks who work on the arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, and other types of community-based responses that are about civic participation and arts. So a lot of that type of initial emphasis on how to respond in a community-based way and how to respond in a preventative way, those conversations began in September. So part of what I'm emphasizing here is how new this response is. We're only 6 months in now to that first attempt to define what's happening as hate-fueled violence by the Biden administration, and not just a national security problem, but as a problem that cuts across all levels of society. And so there is an initiative now going on in the States to create a more systematic approach to a public health response that's kind of coming out of that summit, which I'm happy to talk more about in the question and answer. But I think in general, what we're seeing is a much bigger acknowledgement that the work has to be informed by education, by the arts, by parents and caregivers, by coaches, by mental health professionals on the ground, and not just sit in law enforcement and security. I sometimes call this, our approach all this time has been what we would call secondary prevention, which is teaching people how to barricade the doors, how to mitigate a crisis, how to prevent an attack from happening from an already radicalized individual. Because the US is so concerned about free speech that it has been really reluctant to get involved at earlier levels at the federal level. And I think there's now an acknowledgement that no one wants to live in a world where our best measure of prevention is how good we've become at barricading the doors, which is essentially where we left ourselves over the last 20 years. And there's an acknowledgement that we cannot stay in this place. However, we're 20 years behind, I think, in terms of what we need to be doing. And so I'm optimistic that there's widespread acknowledgement now that that needs to happen. We, for example, in the lab that I run, are overwhelmed with requests to help states and local communities and the federal government with strategies for a public health response. We have funding offers, we have partnership offers, we have all kinds of things just to scale up what we're doing in the lab, which I can talk about. But we are behind. We're really behind what the rest of the world has been doing, and the acknowledgement that the rest of, I think much of the rest of the world, including Brazil, I think made much earlier, that these are problems that sit in society and not just in security. So I will stop with that and really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Cynthia. Now, Professor Guilherme.
Well, thank you so much, Otávio. Thank you for your words, Cynthia. I'm honored to be here having this conversation with you. It's always great to be a part of the initiatives undertaken by the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Foundation, which is basically at the vanguard of the debates, the public discussions on the contemporary political issues, especially the rise of the far right, not only in Brazil, but also in the United States. So let me just start out by focusing or by making a very quick comment on one big difference between the far right in Brazil and the far right in the United States. We have a very recent history of military dictatorships. And when I say dictatorships in the plural form, it's because we've had a military dictatorship in the 1930s that went all the way through 1945, and then another one between 64 and 85. So Brazilians, especially the boomer generation in Brazil, they love the military, and they really see the military as the force behind democracy, albeit it's a very distorted perception of what kind of democracy can be achieved through military intervention. But the military play a very important role in Brazilian politics and in Brazil's far right in general. So I think that that's the main difference, which might even explain some of the power behind Bolsonarism as a political movement, because the military have not only joined the Bolsonaro administration from day one, but the military have also been complicit in letting Bolsonaro supporters storm the presidential palace and the Supreme Court building and the Congress. So I think that that's the main difference, the big difference, if I could put it this way, between Brazil and the United States in terms of the role the military play in supporting, in legitimizing, and in organizing somehow the far-right movement in Brazil. Ever since Bolsonaro lost the elections in October last year, so many Brazilians camped in front of military headquarters all across the country to protest, not only for what they called fraudulent or rigged elections, but also to ask the military to intervene in Brazil so they could restore a kind of democracy that they seem to believe in. So that's the main difference. But as I've been researching for quite some time now, I've even published an article on the Brazilian edition of the Journal of Democracy recently. I think that despite that very important difference, we have so many similarities between the Brazilian far-right and the US far-right in so many ways. And one of my hypotheses is that Brazil, in other words, Bolsonaro could only rise to power as he did. It looked like a very exceptional phenomenon in Brazilian politics, but he has been preparing this ground for at least a decade, which coincides with the big political demonstrations that we had back in 2013 and 2014, for example. And Bolsonaro has paved his way into the presidency by doing something that I call Americanizing Brazilian politics. And what I mean by that is that Bolsonaro was able to warp the public debate in Brazil so as to transform it into the kind of culture war that we have seen in the United States for at least 40 years. Ever since Reagan, we see a kind of culture war going around in the United States that Brazil was oblivious to up until 10 years ago. And that movement of Americanizing Brazilian politics has worked pretty well. And what do I understand by this? I think it's important to establish some parameters here. First of all, Brazil used to have a very consociational kind of democracy. I mean, democracy was seen as this big arrangement between opposing forces sometimes. We have a kind of presidential system, which is very different from the United States in the sense that we have multiple parties and they have to form a majority coalition, sometimes even a supermajority coalition. So this kind of consociational approach to democracy has been abandoned. And Bolsonaro has advanced a form of democracy which is majoritarian, right? And one of Bolsonaro's most important strategies, both in the election period and also during his time as president, was not to negotiate with anyone. So it's basically, I embody the will of the majority, so I have total power to do whatever I want. And Congress is just a detail, and the Supreme Court shouldn't even be there. So this is the first chapter of the Americanization of Brazilian politics. The second one is Brazil has always seen itself from an identity, collective identity perspective, as a pluralistic country, as a country of many religions, as a country of many races. We have even come up at some point with this expression, racial democracy, to describe what Brazil was about from a sociological point of view. And Bolsonaro has also managed to advance a very specific platform that I associate very directly with Christian nationalism. And this is important because not everyone talks about Christian nationalism in Brazil, even though I think it's one of the most fundamental pieces of this puzzle. And the third aspect of the Americanization is a change in the way politics is spoken. So we used to have a very conciliatory language that has been replaced by an adversarial kind of language. So it's always us versus them. It's not to say that other politicians don't do the same things. Of course, especially in election season, it's commonplace for politicians to sit to underline the differences between themselves and the others. But at the same time, we've never seen such a degree of adversarial language being incorporated into the political discussion. And of course, if it's true that Bolsonaro has successfully Americanized Brazilian politics to a great degree, it's also true that Bolsonarism as a political movement has constructed itself as a transnational movement. And of course, there are influences coming from Hungary, coming from Israel, coming from other parts of Latin America, but the main reference for Bolsonaro supporters, for Bolsonaro himself as a politician, for his entourage, has been and still is the United States. And that's probably the reason why when Bolsonaro lost the elections, a few days before Lula taking office, he fled to the United States, to Florida, where he stayed for 3 months. And he even took part in those CPAC conferences, and he was totally integrated to the US far-right environment, right? So Bolsonarism, I think that one of the most important things about Bolsonarism that makes it very much similar to Trumpism is that it's a very different kind of far-right movement because it's a mass movement. It's not just a fringe movement, super extremist. It's malleable from an ideological or from a programmatic point of view. It's very broad in terms of its supporting base. It offers a very distorted yet very compelling concept of democracy to those who believe in whatever Bolsonaro says. There is something, Cynthia, in our constitution, it's the first sentence in our constitution, which is supreme is the people. Just like we the peoples, right? And they kept repeating this motto, supreme is the people, even when they raided the Supreme Court building, because they believe that they own democracy as a collective, but not institutional thing. Bolsonarism is also nativist and authoritarian. It's a different kind of nativism from the one that we find in the United States, because there's no such thing as white supremacism in Brazil. Well, there might be some fringe movements here and there, especially in the southernmost parts of the country, but it's basically Christian supremacism. So the idea, it cuts across race and gender, but it's primarily the notion that Brazil is a country that belongs to the Christians, broadly speaking. There's a British expert on Brazil's evangelical movement who claims that that Bolsonaro is a pan-Christian president, in the sense that he has been able to mobilize not only the emerging evangelical population in Brazil, that today accounts to some 30 to 35% of the population, but also the bulk of Brazil's Catholic population. So that was very important for him, because he is able to speak to both groups with equal efficiency, to put it this way. One of the elements of Bolsonarism is its common enemy. Bolsonaro has declared he would fight cultural Marxism or communism. It's interchangeable, of course, but these expressions, especially cultural Marxism, were totally unknown to Brazil's political lexicon up until Bolsonaro came to power. So the notion of cultural Marxism is something that was very popular in the States, at least from the 1970s on, but in Brazil, it's a more recent thing. And of course, Bolsonaro has also embraced the same strategies of Trump in challenging political institutions, in challenging every single kind of political gatekeeper, from the media to political parties to universities and so on and so forth. There's another slight difference, which is not really meaningful at this point, or which is we have a salvationist approach to politics, unlike the United States, that has had presidents playing the role of presidents, and they know that this role is limited somehow. we are always looking for a kind of messiah in politics. So Bolsonaro has also embodied this kind of messianic approach to politics, which, of course, it's just like Trump, but built from a different kind of political culture. So Bolsonaro, I'd go as far as to say that he has gone even more personalistic than Trump in many respects, because there were no institutions whatsoever mediating between Bolsonaro and his people. When I say that Bolsonarism is a transnational movement, I have pointed out to 4 different groups from which Bolsonaro has built his own amalgam. The first group is the Digital Templars, which is basically a copy, an emulation of the alt-right movement in the United States. So the troll language, the grammar of social media, the aesthetics of the alt-right in the United States have been imported to Brazil by a share of the Bolsonaro movement, which was spearheaded by late philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, philosopher, writer, self-proclaimed guru of the Bolsonaro movement. Many people compare him, Olavo de Carvalho, to Steve Bannon, even though I think that Olavo had a more structuring role in shaping the narrative, the long-term narrative of this kind of alt-right movement translated into the Brazilian reality. Another group that has also been part of this Bolsonarist amalgam was what I call the Patriot Pastors, which is basically this up-and-coming group of evangelical pastors who have become very influential politically in the last 15 to 20 years and who have supported Bolsonaro. But there's a very interesting thing here about the role of these pastors. Their agenda, they have supported Lula. Yeah.
Just if you could conclude, because we have so many questions here.
Oh,
coming.
okay.
So
will do.
So if you could just conclude, then you can come back if you need. But right. We already had about half an hour here, and we have so many questions. So I'm a bit worried.
No problem. So the patriotic pastors who have imported the agenda of the Christian right of the United States. The tropical libertarians, which have basically incorporated all the libertarian narratives based on the First and the Second Amendment rights of the United States, which are totally inadequate for the Brazilian reality. And finally, the pro-gun movement. And this is also a very important thing because the NRA has been putting a lot of money in Brazil. They have put a lot of money in Brazil in recent years. So I compare both movements because I think there are so many similarities and the consequences are also very similar. The January 6th attacks in the Capitol are very much like the January 8th attacks that we had in Brazil a couple of months ago. We have seen mass killings in schools skyrocketing in Brazil, and that's another very important point of concern. And as far as I can say, I mean, if it's true that we live in a political situation which is very much similar to the one of the United States, we might want to look into how the United States has responded to all these things. I'm part of a working group with the Ministry of Human Rights in Brazil that's trying to discuss solutions for hate speech, hate crimes, disinformation, and I think there's a lot to learn from the American experience because as you have said before, Cynthia, you are 2 years, I mean, you might be 20 years late in this process, but you are at 2 years ahead of Brazil. So it's important that we learn from what the American institutions have done to be able to respond accordingly to the threat of the far right in Brazil as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Casarões. Very nice. Good to explain to Professor Cynthia what's going on in Brazil. Sorry to interrupt you. Well, we have a lot of questions, so I would suggest I will make one question for both of you. Professor Cynthia could also comment about what Professor Guilherme said, and then we go on. We have really a lot of questions, so let's go on. The questions I would do for both of you is, are the mechanisms of, it's from a person called Márcio José Vieira, are the mechanisms of democracy prepared to contain and punish extreme right-wing crimes?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, as I said, I'm an optimist in the end, and I do think that the mechanisms of democracy are resilient enough to respond. However, what I often say to questions like this is, you know, the US landed on a global list of backsliding democracies, as you may know, in late 2021. And so, like any slightly nerdy academic, the first thing I did was look at the data and say, well, what happens when you land on a list like that? And it turns out it takes about 9 years on average for a country who has just joined that list of backsliding democracies to get off the list in one direction or the other, right? So about average of 9 years, you either collapse into a not democratic state, or you're restored and get off the list in a positive direction. So, you know, I look at this as now we're, 8 years away from that average, but it's not a quick fix, meaning it's not something we're going to solve before the 2024 election, but we should be aiming to address this by the 2028 election or the 2032 election. Like, these are, medium to long-term problems. They have been happening for more than a decade, and they will need more than they'll need that much time to come out of it. So do I think we have the mechanisms in place? I think the mechanisms are there. Will they be reinforced? Will they be utilized? Will they be built up in the right way? Do we have the community resilience to recognize things that are happening and respond proactively? No, I don't think we have that yet. I think the mechanisms of the institutions are there, which is why I still have faith, although trust is declining on every institution in the US right now. Particularly after Supreme Court rulings last summer. I mean, there's a lot of really low trust in the government and in its institutions in terms of rights being respected. But I do think that, we have time. I don't think that we're headed toward collapse right now, but there is a real sense of urgency that we can't just bide our time and assume that this is going to work out. I think it takes concerted, cultivated effort to restore, strengthen, and resist these forces, both on the mechanisms of enforcement side and on the cultivation side, which is where I see our strategies as particularly weak in terms of strengthening civic engagement, civic participation, civic understanding, and a commitment to a sense of shared purpose. That, I think, needs work.
Professor Guilherme, you can also answer this.
You know, Cynthia, that's the difference between a 250-year-old democracy and a 40-year-old democracy. I don't think we still have, we don't have all the mechanisms in place. And one of the problems, if we look at the Latino barometer polls, for example, or surveys, is that there's a very steep decline in trust in institutions, but people still trust, number one, the church. About 60% of Brazilians really think that the church is a reliable source of political engagement and facts and so on and so forth. And the military comes second. So one of the challenges is that I can only see the recovery of the civic grounds of Brazil coming from the top down. Of course, it could come from the bottom up if Brazil was a more solid democracy, if there was time for people to invest in education efforts. But since we're running against the clock here, I think that the government has to play a very important role in making these things happen. And if it can only come from the top down, the government has to talk to church leaders, to talk to important, prominent pastors in Brazil, reach out to evangelicals, who are currently the greatest opposition to the Lula administration as a group. And they also have to, the government has also got to talk to the military to make sure that these political actors, and the military has unfortunately become a political actor in Brazil, they have to engage in fighting extremism in all its forms. So it's a top-down effort. I think that the Lula administration is interested in doing it. But the question is, will it be able to in 4 years? Maybe we'll have to wait a little bit longer. And Lula himself is a very polarizing figure. He anti-Lula and anti-Workers' Party sentiments have been around for so long. So maybe the next administration with somebody who's neither Lula nor Bolsonaro will be better enabled to perform this change from the top down.
Great. Professor Cynthia, we have a question here from another specialist in extreme right here in Brazil. Her name is Michele Prado. And her question is, here in Brazil, especially among young people, I see a tendency towards salad bar extremism, hybrid extremism. Could you talk a little about it?
Yes, and hello, Michelle. We've never met in person. We will hopefully later in the summer, but we were in touch. And in fact, Michelle is the reason why we translated those resources into Portuguese that I just dropped into the chat. So she reached out and asked, and we did. So, I mean, there's always problems with just translating resources. Of course, there will be things different, but the idea is to get some of these resources into, we've translated them to Spanish and German as well. So there are some helpful things, I hope, that come out of that. And so thank you, Michelle, for always connecting in that way over social media and asking. I would say that, yes, the salad bar extremism, we're absolutely seeing that. We sometimes call it blurry or messy or muddled forms of extremism. What that means is that, again, in the past, if you imagine extremist groups, to join an extremist group, generally you were taken by an individual, invited into a group. There were initiation rites, there were manifestos that were clear, there was an ideology, a chain of command in the actual leaders, and a hierarchy and a belief system. When you're encountering propaganda online, there's a sort of choose your own adventure, pick and choose element to some of it, so that you see very confusing things like some far-right actors in the US praising the Taliban, for example, because this is a strong conservative resurgence of, rejection of feminism and women's rights and rejection of anything non-traditional. But we see other groups, of course, extremely Islamophobic. We see some groups in the US praising Putin, others supporting Ukraine, right? You have unusual kind of fascist ecological groups that are saying, we are white supremacist or fascist, but also there's no room on this planet because of climate change. And so we are promoting something called eco-fascism, which is this blend of environmentalism and anti-immigration, let's say. And so the El Paso shooter in Texas was an eco-fascist and expressed that idea that there's not enough space because of climate change, and we have to stop migration and save the space for white people, essentially. So this is this kind of pick and choose or muddled type of ideology that blends things in ways that can make it quite hard for traditional security studies actors to recognize and respond, because it sometimes doesn't seem as serious. It seems more like just young people espousing, picking and choosing things that they believe in, but it has been shown to still mobilize quite violent actors. They just don't always act in the same way that you expect them to. And they don't always have a clear manifesto. And so you see things like the Texas Uvalde elementary school shooter, who was deeply steeped in misogynistic actions online, not just content, but behaviorally threatening teen girls and in awful ways, but then targets an elementary school with no clear manifesto or link ideologically to why that target was there. So it's one of the reasons why our prevention office within the Department of Homeland Security calls itself now targeted violence and terrorism prevention, because it's not always very clear anymore where terrorism exists versus targeted violence. And in some ways, they're all muddled together. So that's kind of what the salad bar extremism is. It's definitely a global phenomenon. We're seeing it because of the way that people encounter propaganda online, and it just comes to them wherever they are. And then they kind of adopt parts of it without really believing in an entire clear ideological worldview.
Okay. I would like to say something, Guilherme.
Just a very quick comment. It's great to have Michele Prado on board too. I like the expression salad bar, and I think it's particularly adequate to the logic of Brazil's far right, because we do not have a long-standing ideology or an ideological ground that has allowed these movements to flourish, because everything has happened so quickly in Brazil. I mean, it's something that dates back to 20 years ago. So basically, since we do not have this very deep ideological logic guiding extremism in Brazil, they have to pick very selectively the ideological elements that suit them and that speak to them somehow, especially because they have to translate it into the Brazilian reality. So it's a slightly different logic that it's totally convergent with the idea of a salad bar kind of approach.
Excellent. Well, you said, Professor Cynthia, now in Brazil, we are starting to discuss some kind of media, social media regulation. Okay, the new government said they want to do something about this, and the parliament will present some kind of project about this. So we have here a question from, let me see, Lu Cavalheiro. Well, she wants to hear what you have to say about stronger social media regulation as a strategy to immobilize far right. We also have another question about the media. It's about the role of the media in general, okay, not just social media, from Fernando Paulino. Could you talk about the role of the media in the coverage of far-right activities, including attacks, demonstrations, and controversial leaders' speeches? It is possible to reach an agreement among media outlets, journalists, and democratic institutions to prevent, or at least to reduce, the damages of far-right discourse, both in Brazil and in the US. So first, social media regulation, and second, the role of the media.
These are great questions. So the social media regulation, I think we absolutely need more regulation of social media. We need a better way to address the incredible flow of harmful content that comes across. Particularly, my concern is usually young people's feeds, right? So what's coming across, not just on terms of terrorist, anti-democratic, supremacist thinking, but pro-self-harm forums that encourage suicide, forums that encourage eating disorders. I mean, there's just so much harmful content that is really creating a kind of crisis of adolescence in many places, and really some of the worst outcomes that we're seeing for mental health among young people. And we feel this very keenly in the university with our students and what they're experiencing. So I really do think we need that. However, I also usually say, from my perspective, that is not the solution, because I see it the same way that I see law enforcement. It's essentially a solution that is talking about barricading the doors. It is a solution that is talking about trying to stem the flow, but of coming our way, and that would help. But it is not a solution that talks about why is it being produced in the first place, and what is the production, what are the problems, what are the community solutions to prevent more of that from flowing into the pipeline. And we can't just create better systems to suppress, to censor, to surveil, to monitor, to interrupt plots without also addressing the more upstream set of problems. So my interest is really in, I want someone to solve some of the problems around regulation and stop the flow, but I don't want that to be the panacea, or just have some idea that solves our problem, because to me, the bigger issue is, why does so much of it get produced? What are we missing in the upstream world? And how do we interrupt the fundamental anti-democratic and supremacist way of thinking about humanity and about the way we relate with each other and our engagement in the world? So I think we have to do both. The second thing is the role of the media in the coverage. This is really, really important. And it's one of the frustrating things. I think, being a person in the field who gets asked to talk to the media a lot, there's constantly shifts in who's covering. So people, new beats, new coverage. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done in this space. And I think that's an area where foundations and think tanks can play a big role in educating and continuing to educate the media on appropriate ways to cover what's harmful and what's not harmful. So, for example, we did a lot of work to try to educate American media when the far right started calling themselves the alt-right, the alternative right, that was a rebranding effort on the part of the far right to soften their neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideas. And it did soften it. It made it seem more palatable. We're just alternative. We're just a different way of thinking. We're not, we're not extremists. We're alt-right, alternative. But they're very white supremacist ideas behind that, and very harmful ideas. So we really urge the media to not use that term, to not adopt it unproblematically. So I will use it, but only in quotation marks and only with an acknowledgement, because it does refer to a specific period of time in the US and a particular kind of manifestation of the far right, but it can't be unproblematically adopted. I think we also see sometimes a lot of platforming of former extremists who are not fully out of the scene really, but say they are, or they haven't really given up the ideas, or they don't understand themselves yet, that the things they're saying. So they'll say, well, I wasn't really a white supremacist, I was just promoting white civil rights, as if that's better. And sometimes then people just cover that unproblematically. And so I think there's a scholar, Kathleen Belew, who a historian here, who's an excellent scholar, and she helped lead a group of scholars. I was a part of it, to write a guide for the Associated Press guide, AP guide, to covering some of these terms, what words can be used and not. And that's in a book called The Field Guide to White Supremacy, I think, for the US journalists, in particular, English language journalists, to use. So I think there's a lot more effort there. And I would love to see, more support for journalists and the media in the education side, especially because so many new journalists come into the field, young journalists with really great intentions, and don't mean to do some of the platforming that happens. And just one really bad example that happened to me when I was interviewed for a major national news show here in the US, and they also interviewed someone who's part of a white supremacist extremist group. And during the interview, 11 seconds of my interview got used, which is fine. I'm not complaining about that. But 2 minutes of his interview got used, during which he left his laptop open, refreshed the screen, and it said, "Join us." And it was their recruitment page. And that got aired on national morning television in the US, one of the most popular television shows. And their membership jumped hundreds of people, and in a very short time, as soon as it aired. And that was a good example of direct harm that I know wasn't intentional, because I know the journalist and the producer were trying to expose, but it was done very badly and in ways that caused, I think, direct harm by increasing the attention and showing people how to join up with the group. So, I think there are lots of things that need to be done to educate and try to prevent that type of thing from happening again.
Professor Casarões.
Cynthia, in Brazil, it took 4 years. Newspapers and TV channels took 4 years to judge whether it was better to call Bolsonaro a far-right president, or right-wing president, or just a conservative president. So we kind of got lost amid a cacophony of different concepts that journalists didn't really know how to use. But I think that I just have one thing to say about this. As long as extremism serves the business model of both the big techs and mainstream media, it's going to be around, because there's no way to censor it. There are legal tools to curb some of these super extremist movements, but at the same time, and we see this whole discussion about Twitter and Elon Musk ever since he took over, the kind of hate speech that has gone around Twitter. I think that the only way is to make extremism less profitable, or not profitable at all, to both online and offline media.
I would like to bring to the discussion two perspectives, one from the opposition and one from the government. Okay, so I will first talk about the opposition and then the government. So the opposition, well, we have been following the Republican crisis, okay, big crisis in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party seems to be not anymore the Republican party of the past. Okay, so with a strong position about economy and a real alternative for politics and things like that. And it's much more getting more extremist and also more hijacked by Trump. So I would like you to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Republican Party. Could it change again? Could it find a new way, or it's really a very dangerous situation they are facing now? How can you explain to us what's going on there? And also, Professor Casarões, I would like you to talk about the Brazilian right. Okay, it's important that the Brazilian right comes back and starts to present an alternative for Brazil. So.
Yeah, great question. I have often wished that we had a parliamentary system in the US, because I think if you did, you would see more accurately, as you do in other countries, where the fringes sit and where the majority sits, and what is a centrist, and what is not. And what we have in this two-party system is you end up with, a much wider range of ideological beliefs and of political beliefs and social and economic ideas being collapsed into just two categories that people have to vote for. And I think it's very clear that that system doesn't actually very easily reflect the way people think. And so that's the first problem right there, is that people have to put themselves into only two boxes, and it doesn't actually capture what you can capture in other places, like their most important idea is voting for the Green Party, or their most important idea, the things that they want to put forward, economic, conservative, but socially liberal. There are parties like that in other countries. That doesn't exist here. So this fact that you have to force it into two categories is always been problematic. And what we've seen more recently is that got much more problematic. And I absolutely think that's the right word, Octavia, to use, hijack, because I think what's happened to the Republican Party is like a hijacking of the party by the extreme fringe ideas and actors who have now kind of holding hostage the party itself, which is not to say that they're blameless, everybody else, because what happens is the extreme actors have, particularly because of Trump's popularity for so many years, been able to control how elections work. And so dissenters knew that they're giving up their chance for re-election. And we saw that happen time and time again. When Republicans spoke out against it, they then tended to lose their next election. And so I think there's some calculations that happen in the Republican Party among more moderate and centrist folks is, am I doing more good by staying here? Or if I speak up and I end up losing this election and then I'm out, so some of it's ego, of course, some of it's about career, but some of it also is, I think, about what happens if we just let ourselves be all voted out by this kind of unbelievably powerful, movements that have populist movements have seized kind of the voting power of the Republican Party, and often with conspiracy theories and disinformation as well around election denialism or about QAnon or other types of things as they intersect with it. So I don't have a solution to that. I think, we also see that type of problem happening on the Democratic side with real division between like the Bernie Sanders supporters versus the Biden supporters, the kind of more centrist versus the more progressive, very liberal, or even radical sides of the Democratic Party. But ultimately, it hasn't been driven by the same type of disinformation or the populist fever, if you will, that kind of has taken over large segments of the population and allowed those votes to continue. So I think that's how I would characterize what's happening, is that it is a hijack. I am not I'm not a political strategist in any way. So I'm glad that I'm not, because I think it's a terrible time to have to figure out a strategy for the Republican Party. They are espousing incredibly unpopular things. So, the vast majority of Americans want more gun control. The vast majority of Americans want reproductive rights. But we don't have them now because the people are mobilized to vote by Republican party platforms that are able to get those policies secured, even though they don't reflect what the majority of Americans say they want in polls. So it's a really difficult situation when the majority of people want something, especially like gun control and reproductive rights are the two big examples that are no longer reflected in the laws that are being passed by a small group of people who no longer reflect what people want. But that's who's showing up to vote these people in. So it's a real disarray situation. And I'm, like I said, glad that I'm not a strategist.
Okay, Professor Guilherme.
Yeah, the great thing about being able to compare both countries and both democracies is that there's some interesting insights from this kind of comparison. The United States is progressively becoming a multi-party system within the two-party logic. And Brazil is becoming a two-party logic in the context of a multi-party system. Bolsonarism is not a party-based movement. And this is important because there was no such thing as hijacking the party because there was no party to begin with. Bolsonaro has just rented or leased a political party to run in 2018. And then he broke with everyone from that party, and then he governed Brazil for 2 years without belonging to a party, which is unusual in any democracy. The thing is that Bolsonaro's power has been so intense over the last 4 years that it was virtually impossible for any right-wing politician to get elected or to have his or her voice heard without taking sides with Bolsonaro. And that has caused a big damage to Brazil's democracy because at some point, even those moderate right-wing politicians in Brazil, they had to take sides with Bolsonaro, otherwise they would be called communists. And as they did take sides with Bolsonaro, they've also contributed to the undermining, the further undermining of Brazil's democracy. I think that now, especially after January 8th, we might see a rebranding and a revitalization of Brazil's right-wing movement or right-wing politicians, not a movement per se, but a bunch of politicians who declare themselves being on the right side of the spectrum. They may have a chance to fill in the void that Bolsonarism is probably going to leave at some point. This movement is a very slow one. We see São Paulo Governor Tarcísio Freitas, who is a former Bolsonaro minister, adopting very sensible policies. So that's a very important thing that we are seeing. We see Minas Gerais Governor Romeu Zema taking very moderate decisions. So I think that these two examples, they just illustrate the kind of alternative that we might have to Bolsonaro in this right-wing camp in Brazil. The problem is that we've never really, ever since redemocratization in the 1980s, we've never had a true and solid right-wing political party or political movement in Brazil, because it was too embarrassing to call yourself a right-winger, because everyone associated being on the right side of the spectrum with the military dictatorship. So you didn't want to be there. So I think that now it's the time for right-wingers, true conservatives, if I could talk in these terms, to fill in the vacuum, to restore Brazil's Republican institutions, and to push Bolsonaro away from the political debate. But it's still very hard to be a politician in Brazil without taking sides with Bolsonaro, especially if you're on the left, on the right, sorry. So that's the challenge that many politicians are currently facing. There's a question for you. Marcelo is asking a question. It's in English. So in Brazil, we have watched the spread of extremism among the elderly.
Yeah.
Have you seen the same in the United States, and any idea on why it happens?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really fascinating question, and part of it is tied to the pandemic. So we had this period of time when, prior to the pandemic, when we could regularly say with confidence that the most at-risk group for violence were young men, white men in particular, under the age of 35. That is a really big category, but that's the category that were most likely to be violent actors. We saw some outliers. There were some 43-year-olds, once in a while, someone in their 50s, but that really was completely different, first of all, on January 6th, when you had both a pretty high percentage of women participating compared to previous events, something like 15% of the arrested actors anyway. And you saw that those women were not just young women either, but grandmothers, people with gray hair. They're traveling with their sons, they're traveling with their families. And some of them were quite violent as well, which was quite unusual. So that demographic change. And then we also have had a lot of older men, and also mass shootings that are not necessarily far right, but mass shootings by older Asian men. There have been 3 in the recent period of time that were also quite unusual. Men in their 70s even, and really unusual demographic for us. Of course, the last thing I'll say is that even on the nonviolent side, we have had large numbers of older Americans swept up by QAnon conspiracy theories, by election denialism, and by false claims about groomers, about the danger posed to children from child trafficking rings, that the biggest danger to children, in fact, is not firearms, but groomers, they think, so we've seen this type of stuff in surveys. And so the connector between all of that, obviously people were spending much too much time online and watching cable news, frankly, and really divisive cable news shows. But then there was also this flood of disinformation coming their way, including disinformation that came from people they trusted as sources for information, like media pundits and elected officials, and even the president, around the election denialism and the election fraud claims. So I think we've had this disruption, and this is where we're also seeing declining trust in expertise, in science, in facts, and knowledge, and attacks on the university itself, attacks on the media, as biased or as partisan, and or as just not true, right? People have a really hard time understanding that distinction. And the last thing I want to say on that, this is also an anecdote, but I recently gave a talk to a large audience that was primarily concerned about anti-Semitism, and the audience was older, mostly elderly retirees who were all very worried about anti-Semitism, rising anti-Semitism in the US. And then afterward, I got this question from one of these older women who was a holistic practitioner who, during the question, espoused a lot of disinformation and conspiracy theories about masks and about vaccines. And, so there's also, it's clear that there's no immunity to disinformation. Just because you recognize the propaganda and disinformation in one category, like anti-Semitism, you can recognize the harms being caused by disinformation or Holocaust denialism. But here's a person who understood that very clearly, but still had gone down a rabbit hole of disinformation about the science behind protecting yourself with a mask, and believed that that's harmful, and or that the vaccine was, had conspiracies about that. So you can have, that's also problematic, and something that's hard for people to wrap their head around, that we see rising anti-Semitism from the left, or rising different types of, that's part of that salad bar extremism, but also different populations believing some propaganda while disgusted by other types of propaganda.
On the same note, Cynthia, I was talking to a colleague and a friend, Isabella Calil. Has also participated in some of the foundation's events, and she ran an ethnographic survey with protesters, pro-Bolsonaro protesters, from 2018, prior to his election, and all the way through last year. And one of the things that she has found out is that there are two basic demographics which have become extremely violent and super attached to Bolsonaro. Men and women, but predominantly men over, I think, 55. And there's an explanation for that. I think it's a three-pronged explanation. First thing is they have a very different way of dealing with social media. They don't really, I'm not saying that they are digital illiterates, but they tend to take fake news by face value. They tend not to do research to make sure that things are claims are false or true, and they tend to believe in most things that they see online. So that's the first explanation. The second is they really miss the good old days of when they were young, and that's a complicated thing, because in Brazil, it overlaps with the times of the military dictatorship. So you see people praising the military regime, even though it was a full-fledged dictatorship, not because of the regime per se, but because they were teenagers and young adults at the time. So it's something else that they are looking for. It's not really the political element of it. And there's a third thing, which is especially for lone elders who do not have a family next to them, who have been abandoned by their family members. They sometimes find connection with others on social media, on WhatsApp groups, for example. So they are more prone to believe in whatever they get to. And that's the kind of laboratory for fake news, extremism, denialism, and so conspiracy theories of all kinds. And the other group, the other demographic group, is people under 30. And it's interesting because the reason why they support Bolsonaro is fundamentally different. He has become hip to be Bolsonarista at some point. So it's part of a different group logic, but they are also very enthusiastically supportive of Bolsonaro. And of course, this generation under 30 is one that was born and bred in the context of social media. So they also have a very different way to watch the news and to deal with facts. So there are these two demographics, which are very similar to the ones that we find in the United States. And surprisingly, a lot of women involved in these, even in the violent part of the movements. Out of the 1,300 people who have been arrested following the January 8th attacks in Brazil, I think that some 500 were women.
No, that I'll just really quickly say, just to jump in, I think that's on 2 points there, really interesting to follow up on. One, and I didn't mention this when I was talking about the mainstreaming, but often when I talk about youth culture support for the far right, it's what I describe it as a weaponization of youth culture. And so a lot of what we've seen in that under 30 or even under 20 demographic is the fact that the far right became a space of rebellion. It became the space for edgy irony, satire, content that was a way of rejecting mainstream respectability and sometimes using humor and then everybody else was just a triggered snowflake who couldn't take a joke, right? And so they kind of successfully weaponized this in t-shirts and memes and in the use of humor and satire and irony, but it's still carrying a lot of anti-democratic and hateful and supremacist content with it. And so, but it has this plausible deniability then, like, oh, it's just a joke and you can't, this serious mainstream, these serious people like my parents or the teachers just don't get it. They don't get our jokes. So I think that has been really dangerous to the success of like successfully claiming youth culture, the rebellious side of youth culture. Like they became counterculture, positioned themselves as the counterculture to a very serious mainstream that's promoting diversity and equity and inclusion and social cohesion. And we're the ones that can reject that. And this is how you do it. And the other thing, it's just about the elderly. I think one of the things that when you were talking, it made me think that, we often emphasize how important it is to talk about digital and media literacy across the life course. And, we often emphasize youth and school-based digital literacy, but it's so clear that the elderly population needs resources to, when we get into deep fake videos and AI generated images, I mean, these things are just going to get harder and harder for people to understand how to be skeptical and how to detect what is real from what is not. And not just in extreme anti-democratic content, but even we have a lot of elderly falling for all kinds of scams of people contacting them. And it seems legitimate that your Netflix account has been shut down, and just put in, contact us. And then all of a sudden, all your bank details are gone. And so those types of phishing attempts are often targeting the elderly in really harmful ways. So I think there's a much bigger digital literacy question here that has to happen with older communities as well.
Professors, sorry, I had a problem with my connection here. I hope I can get to the end. Well, we have only more 15 minutes. So I have two questions I would like to ask both of you. I hope you can answer them in short time. And then, of course, I will give you 2 minutes to conclude, okay? So I will bring one question from a Brazilian journalist, Lorival Santana. He works for CNN Brazil, okay? And what would you say about Brazilian government that has changed from extreme right to the left? And it's not only maintaining a complacent approach to Putin's aggression against Ukraine, but strengthening its partnership with Russia and China. Lavrov was here in Brazil yesterday, and now on his way to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Putin is a non-declared sponsor of the extreme right around the globe. So I think, I'm sorry I took my image off because I thought it would get better here to talk to you. But, well, I think that both of you could speak a little bit about this.
I've been giving a lot of interviews on Brazil's positions on the Ukraine war and Russia. I think that Bolsonaro and Lula both look up to Putin by different reasons, for different reasons. Bolsonaro really saw Putin as an authoritarian and religious nationalist kind of figure who was pushing for a conservative agenda in Russia. Bolsonaro sees Putin as a strong man who he wants to emulate or to mimic somehow. So I think that that's one reason why the Brazilian government has supported Russia from the beginning of the war. Albeit in very ambiguous fashion. So it was not an explicit support to Russia, but it was just, well, we're going to condemn the aggression, but we're not going to talk a lot about it. We're not going to point fingers to Putin and so on and so forth. In Lula's case, I think that the logic is different because Lula really sees Russia as the beacon of anti-imperialism, which is, in my view, an extremely outdated perspective on what Russia represents today. I mean, as a Democrat and as a scholar, I cannot really understand why so many left-wing people believe that Russia is the savior of the multipolar order or something like that. I see no problem in making partnerships with countries like China and Russia. We have to be pragmatic. We have to understand that some of these countries are very interesting for Brazil in terms of the national interest. But I do not think that it's okay just to repeat the kind of Russian propaganda that we have seen going around. Putin and Zelensky being equally responsible for the war and things like that. I think that Lula is really missing the point in his rhetoric. Even though Brazil's actions, which is let's try to mediate the conflict, let's try to bring other countries together to talk peace, I think this is correct. But the rhetoric, I feel embarrassed to see that there are people supporting Putin's narrative on the war and on anything else for that matter.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that is probably not a very nice observation of my own fellow citizens, which is that I think it's very hard to overstate how parochial most Americans are. And I think meaning that we get very little, I was just talking about this before we began, very little international news coverage. You have to deliberately seek it out. you have to really dig into the coverage. Even the local news coverage is so local. It's like, if you turn on your local television coverage, it's about your local small neighborhood and town and the small events that are happening there for the first 20 minutes before they get to anything national, before they get to, I don't know the history of that or why we have such parochial news and media coverage, but I know that it's there, and it can be, you really have to make an effort to learn about anything in the rest of the world. And we don't learn very much about it in our school system either. It's a very, not just parochial, but isolationist mentality. And so I think that although we have pockets, I mean, of course, among intellectuals, among policymakers, among politicians, you have opinions and pundits around opinions about Russia and Ukraine. I think that the ordinary American citizen doesn't think about anything outside of the US very often. They don't even, most Americans, don't even travel very far outside their own state most of the time. So, these are very, very local kinds of issues that people raise. And when they're thinking about Putin or they're thinking about Ukraine, they're only hearing the top line types of things about, they're not really digging in for the most part. And I don't mean to disparage Americans, in this way. I think that it's the way the whole system is set up, what you're exposed to, what you read. Every time I'm out of the country, I'm always amazed that the top line stories above the fold in every newspaper are often about something happening in a country outside of the country I'm in. That's almost never the case in the US. It's extremely rare, I think, except for in the very large national newspapers. And even there, it's mostly national coverage. So, I just wanted to add that point in because I think that's quite a big difference, I sense, to Brazil and to other, certainly everywhere else I've lived overseas and been overseas, how much a part of ordinary daily discourse and dinner table conversation events are in the rest of the world, and how rare that is here, except sometimes among immigrant communities with diaspora relationships. And so it's not that people don't have opinions, but they are not really very well informed and often don't think about it very much at all.
The last question for both of you, it's very important that we talk about the political future of Trumpism and Bolsonarism. Both Bolsonaro is a little bit far away, we still have 3-4 years to go, but Trump is very near next year. So if Trump comes back, is democracy in danger? What is the political future of Trumpism? And then Professor Casarões could talk a little bit about the situation of Bolsonarism and the government. Is it behaving well? It's going well in making it smaller?
I think that, Trump is declining in popularity, of course, as we know, but still remains very dangerous in the kind of, particularly in the campaign season. I'm less worried about success on the electoral side of things right now, although that may come, but I'm quite worried about what happens in this very volatile period of time if these types of, not just dog whistles, but talking about hiring an extreme anti-Muslim advisor, as recently happened and then didn't happen, but these sorts of ideas about what the rhetoric is going to be like, what the harm is to local communities, to members on the ground who end up being the recipient of tremendous hate when these things are kind of unleashed in national dialogue, and you have anti-immigration language, racist dog whistles, or other kinds of misogynistic comments. And you see, we're seeing, I think, some of that repercussion of what is seen as a perceived legitimation and normalization of hateful content. So that's my biggest concern right now, is how do we get the communities equipped to grapple with, just like we've seen tremendous rise in misogynistic contents from teenage boys in middle schools right now, teachers, high school teachers, because of Andrew Tate's influence online, and you see these comments like that you just couldn't believe that a teenager is going to say things like a 12-year-old telling a teacher, go make me a sandwich. I don't have to take that test because you're a woman. I don't have to take a test from you, right? We're seeing these kinds of repercussions in everyday life when they're encountering influencers online or politicians who espouse things that they then see as legitimate and as a path forward. And so, that I really worry about. I think on the electoral side, it's not only Trump we have to worry about. There are plenty of other candidates waiting in the wings who are also very anti-democratic and who may even be more effective as anti-democratic leaders than he was, and at unraveling rights that have been hard won, I think, all these years. So I definitely don't think we're out of the woods yet. And my biggest concern is the next 16, 18 months in terms of what gets unleashed.
Well, the problem of talking about a transnational phenomenon as the one that we are witnessing both in the United States and in Brazil is that things that might happen in Brazil end up being very predictable. So pretty much everything that has taken place in the United States since Trump lost the elections in 2020 is also taking place in Brazil in very similar shapes and forms. So this is one thing that we have to worry about. I mean, the kind of strategies that the far right has used in the United States have ended up being the same strategies that the Brazilian far right is currently using in Congress and in mainstream media and also online. So I think that this is one thing. I predict, if I may, I'm not sure if that's even possible from a social science perspective, but I think that what we're going to see in the next few years is the growth of radicalization of the Bolsonaro movement, however you want to call it. It might be just Brazil's far-right movement, it doesn't matter, because with or without Bolsonaro, the culture war is on. And the kinds of strategies and grammars and the logic of the culture war is already in place. So I think that this is something that we're going to see for the years to come. Now, when it comes to Lula, I think that the main thing about the Lula administration, it's just completed 100 years in office. So it's too early to tell if Lula is doing doing a good job taking down the far right. But I think that there are two things about the Lula administration that we have to look into. I mean, for the coming months or years. First of all, I think that the left in Brazil and the Lula administration in particular have to learn how to navigate online spaces, have to learn how to talk to people online. And this is something that the right does very well. The right's able to come up with conspiracy theories and memes and online baits, which are very, very attractive. They appeal to the average person. So that's, I think that most on the left, they come off as elitist folks because they do not really understand the logic of the average person and how information gets to the average Brazilian. So this is one thing. Communication is key, and the government's still trying to find a sound strategy of communication, and it has so far fallen short of communicating effectively. And it's not just about online spaces. I think that the government has to reach out to churches, to church leaders, to social, to grassroots movements of all kinds, conservative or progressive, it doesn't really matter. But I think that the government has to make this effort. Now, and why do I say this? I say this because if Lula doesn't do a good job, if Lula fails to deliver whatever he has promised to deliver, including reducing inequality in the country, putting the economy back on track, and so on and so forth, anti-workers' party and anti-Lula sentiments might just arise again. And that's the perfect setting for Bolsonaro to come back, or for any other extremist politician to run for president successfully. So I think this is something that Americans also worry a lot about. I mean, is Biden being able to deliver whatever he has promised? And will Biden's failure represent the return of Trump, or I don't know, Ron DeSantis for that matter? It doesn't really matter who, but the kind of agenda, very extremist agenda. So I think that Lula will have to find a way to speak to more people and to, of course, rebuild civic culture from the top down. That's what I said before. So these are big challenges. I'm not sure if he's going to able to live up to these challenges in 4 years, but we have to keep the hopes up.
We had a lot of questions, we made our best here. I would like to thank both of you. I think it was a great discussion, and it's very nice to hear you two talking. We learn a lot. So now you have about 1 minute or 2 minutes to finish, and then we say bye-bye.
Yeah, I will just finish by saying I tried as best as I could to keep up in the chat with the questions in English at least, and I want to thank the audience for such interesting and generative questions, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but really valued this dialogue. And also, Guilherme, I thought the discussion was really, I learned a lot, and this discussion was quite fascinating for me. So I would just conclude by saying, you know, I think we're still on a path that history, you know, we don't have any idea what it's going to look like in front of us, if that makes sense. I mean, no one ever knows what the future looks like, but I feel like there are predictable periods and there are unpredictable periods. And we are in an extremely unpredictable period in the US, is the way I would describe it. There are trends, but there's also huge gaps, I feel like, in understanding, for me, what things are going to look like. And how we get there. It's one of the reasons why I have shifted a lot of my optimism and my hopeful way of thinking to the local level, to state legislatures and to mayor's offices and county offices, where there is often a lot of work going on, and where you can build political will that might be more sustainable than what we're seeing at the federal level, which is this: every time an administration changes, the entire strategy changes, and they erase and they, you know, get rid of other legislation. And it's very difficult to see a sustainable path, I think, at the federal level in the US right now, because there's such divergence and such polarization in the strategies, and such political wins by erasing things that the previous administration did. So you can't count on anything sticking around, even legislation that passes. You think, oh, there'll be some presidential, you know, way to erase it, or pardon, or do something that erases something that the previous administration accomplished. So I think I would just urge all of us to think about what can happen on the local level, what can happen at the community and the state or regional level, to work on democracy strengthening initiatives there as well, and not only look to the federal level, which has been most of our discussion. But I very much appreciate the invitation and found this to be just a fascinating way to spend my morning. So I wish there were an opportunity to continue. Thank you.
Professor Casarões.
Otávio, thank you again for the opportunity. Cynthia, I'm going to conclude the way I have opened my remarks. It's an honor. It's a privilege to be here and to hear your thoughts on such an important discussion, which has to do with not only the local and national movements, but also how they connect transnationally, and how the lessons learned in the US will also teach us in Brazil how to overcome the radical setting that we have been facing over the years. I think that the solution, I mean, there's no quick fix, there's no easy solution for anything that we have discussed. But I think that one of the paths is to talk and talk and talk. I mean, to reach out to people, to talk to people about what's going on, to maybe, I don't want to sound like patronizing, but to tell people what democracy is really about, which is not the will of the majority. It's not a tyranny of the majority, but rather it's a system where everyone should have their say, and everyone should participate. So I think that that's key. I mean, when I speak of the government having to reach out to people, I mean, that's what I mean. We have, as scholars, as politicians, as members of the government, as bureaucrats, to talk to as many people as we can, so that we can preserve our democracy and preserve our civic culture, broadly speaking. So thank you so much for that.